hard to fulfill the greatest commandment when you're not plugged in and you're not around others. You're kind of just doing half the work.
Welcome to episode number 8 of the Common Questions podcast series. My name is Jonathan Ciecka, and I'm joined here today by Mr. Jord'n Bay. Jord'n, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Ciecka. Really appreciate it.
Jord'n, tell me what a young Jord'n Bay was like. What was your life like growing up?
My life growing up, I would say I grew up in a Christian cultured home. So I grew up going to a Christian private school, learning about the Bible, not really ever going to church, and never really believing that. I say culture because it was very much just if you knew the right answers, if you could pass the tests of the Bible classes that I would be in, then you kind of have a relationship with him. And I grew up on a farm, so a lot of early mornings, which was fun, but also it was a good time. I remember being in the barn, putting up tobacco, all that fun stuff, cattle everywhere. So a lot of land, a lot of free roam, free range kind of stuff. So spent a lot of time by myself, even though I had 2 brothers. I didn't really spend much time with other people. I was pretty much kind of a loner, and would kind of be either in my room or outside doing something. So by myself. So
cool.
Yeah.
And when would you say that you came into a personal relationship with Jesus? What did that look like?
That was in high school, around junior year. I think the summer before my junior year of high school, I came into a personal relationship with Jesus. Because throughout kind of my life, I knew that there was something higher than me, but I just, for some reason, that just hardened heart of rebellion was in me. And I remember so specifically, I remember in 8th grade, specifically talking to someone, and I just made a comment, yeah, if I die, I would go to hell, and I'm okay with that because I don't want to be around Jesus. I was like, at the time before I was a Christian, my hell was spending eternity with Jesus. I was like, that sounds awful. And it's so weird being in middle school and thinking that, but that was just my reality. And eventually that depravity and that separation from him just led me to my destruction of ultimately trying to commit suicide. And so God's so graciously intervening and being gracious towards me and sparing my life and bringing me to him. And I just remember when I realized that Jesus is the one that saved me from that, just being so eternally grateful. So grateful of being like, man, I'm loved that much. So, and then I had a guy that really discipled me really, really well throughout high school. And he was my cross country coach. So we'd be running for our 8th period. We'd do it together. And I just poke his brain all the time, man. Just be like, what about this? What about that? I'm reading my Bible. It says this. What's up with this? So I just had kind of that, just like really good people kind of pouring into me. And yeah, so.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing all that.
Absolutely.
So the topic that we're talking about today is about going to church. We already recorded the video about how it's important that you actually do go to church. Mm-hmm. But then the follow-up question to that is, okay, great. Where? Mm-hmm. Which one? Because especially here in the American South, there's a lot of options. And even in different parts of the country, there can be kind of an overwhelming number of choices where you're like, okay, of all the churches, which church? So that's what we're going to be talking about. And if people get one thing out of this episode, what do you want that one thing to be?
I'd say to be in a church that believes and teaches the Bible. That doesn't have to be exactly expository like us. I'm partial to it, right? I'm a little biased. I really enjoy it. People that end up moving and have had that are like, man, that was really good. That was something really good that I missed that we had, that they had at a church, is the expository teaching. But getting to go into a place that has the foundation that is the Bible, something concrete that they can always go back to, that also is infallible, which I know that we talked about that in previous episodes. So check it out if you haven't. So, But yeah, just definitely that of going to a church that has a Bible, that believes in the Bible, has a Bible as well. So hopefully they have those.
Yeah, hopefully they have a few on hand. And what's kind of the alternative to that, if, or maybe what's the marker that a church does really have a good view of Scripture? Because there could be theoretically a church that says, yeah, sure, we believe it, but they have a very specific idea of what believing means. What would you say are some markers of like, yeah, this is a church that actually takes God's word seriously?
I think the hard part is at times you just have to get involved to see that. You have to get involved in the community to actually see, do they practice what they preach? When they say, hey, be patient with people, looking at the fruit of the spirits, do they love people well? Are they involved in their community? Do they have people that want to stick around in that community? Trying to make sure that there is tangible evidence and that when they go through and they are teaching the Bible, that outside of that, the people on the team, the people high level volunteers are doing the things that they're preaching, and actually going out and practice what they're preaching.
So it takes a little bit of time of actually getting involved in someone's teaching and in their ministry to see what it is that they actually believe and actually do. And for a lot of people who are maybe new to an area or looking for a new church, the easiest option nowadays might be, oh, I'm just going to watch the live stream for a couple of weeks. And then, well, that one didn't really work out. I'm going to watch all these different live streams. What do you think about that? Just checking out church by live stream, or maybe just that's your church involvement. Well, I'm getting the same thing. I'm watching all the same content. Why isn't that just as good? Or is it?
Yeah. So I think when it comes to live stream and watching a video recording of a service, I think that there's goodness to that, because as I tell my volunteers, you got to have vacations. You got to have time away. Like, you work hard, you serve well, you pour time and resources into, I'm a student director at the Tullahoma campus, and you pour your time and energy and prayers into this group. You deserve a vacation and time off. So that's good in that you have those recordings, you have those live streams, so that when you're shown on Florida, you can spend time looking at the live stream. That's good. And also I think it's good because, say this happened with one of the families that attends the Tullahoma campus where I'm at. And this family, they were like, okay, we're moving to Tullahoma. We know that that's coming up in 3 months. Where are we going to go? Because as soon as they got to that area, they were like, I want to go to church. I want to be involved in the community. So they looked at a bunch of different areas that had live stream. They had a bunch of videos on it, and they were like, okay, let's check these out and let's see what they're preaching. And so I think that's good in it, but I just really encourage you to, if you are in the area, if you live in that area, get plugged in physically. Sometimes it can be awkward, especially when you're the first person and you show up and it's not a big church and they kind of notice, oh, there's a new person. I worked at a church up in Vermont for a bit, and it was noticeable when a new person walked in because it was small enough that you could notice that. And you're like, oh, we had a new person. Let's check it out. Let's talk to them. And so there's that awkwardness of it. Sometimes people want to show up and I just want to observe. I don't want to talk. But I really encourage you to kind of get plugged in, because there's only so much you can learn from a video. There's only so much you can get from a place that is a place of worship and community that you can only get from something that you're watching online. So I just really, really encourage you to, anybody that's watching this, get plugged in, search it out, check every single, even if you have to rotate churches every single week, continue to do that. I think of a volunteer of mine. That's what he did. He's like, his family, he's just like, I don't know where to go, but they kept going to a different church every single week in person until it was like, okay, this is where we're at. And they, thankfully and gratefully, they landed the experience and they're like, this is where we want to be. So I'm super grateful for that. So.
Yeah, and I think there's something to the way that we're designed as well, that we're made to be in a physical, in-person community. If you try to replace that with just images and on a screen and sound coming out of a speaker, that it doesn't fit what you were designed for, I would say. Now, this is a maybe a little bit stickier of one, but one that I know that some people have talked about before, where they find a church that they don't live anywhere near, and really enjoy that pastor's preaching and really enjoy their stuff. And they say, well, I don't have anything this good in my area. Like, I couldn't possibly get Matt Chandler quality preaching from where I'm at in Moscow, Idaho, I guess. But so what would you say to those people who are thinking like, well, I want the best possible preaching and this is it right here that I'm getting on a video. Why would I settle for something less at an in-person church? What would you say to that?
I'd push back a little bit. I'd push back specifically with the preaching. Preaching is an hour and a half, sometimes an hour of your week. And that's good. And bringing up Matt Chandler, one thing I appreciate about him is he even says like, hey, the sermons that I do, when you watch them online, I've seen a few, he says they are supplemental. And that's what they're meant to be. They're meant to be supplemental. They're not meant to replace a place of community, of being in person and actually talking to people and getting to know them. And it's hard to, and it's not impossible, but it is hard to be involved in a community that's a few thousand miles away. And it's hard to be involved in a group of people that you can just confess things to and you can be vulnerable with, that are there, that can, when you walk in on Sunday, that they ask like, hey, how's it going? And then you say like, man, I'm really struggling with my kid or my spouse or my grandfather's not doing well health-wise. And then they're there to be like, well, hey, how was it? And the following week, they check up on you and they say, hey, how is your grandfather? How is your kid? I know that you said you struggled with that. The preaching is important. It's extremely important, but it's a both and situation. You got to have the community as well. And you just don't get that from watching online. You just don't.
And you mentioned the vulnerability in there. Obviously, that family that you were talking about that checked out a different church every single week, they eventually landed somewhere that they were going to pick as their long-term home church. I've known a lot of people over the years who seem to never really get out of that church shopping phase where it's just, well, I haven't found the right place yet. I'm still trying to find somewhere else to land. Or they've been somewhere for a couple months and they go, well, I just don't know if it's really the place where I like want to really get involved. What would you say is a good principle for keeping in mind of like, okay, we're trying to find a church, we're trying to get involved, but eventually you just got to pick something. How would you navigate that?
I'd encourage the person that is doing that, or if I found myself in that place, I would eventually have to ask myself, is the reason that I am not wanting to get involved or haven't found a place because of a preference? Or is it because that God is genuinely not calling me to the places that I've been at? That was kind of how the family that I brought up was. They were searching and they were saying, we just felt awkward. It just didn't feel right. And eventually they did actually find a place where they stuck it out for about 2-3 months. And then the experience popped up and then they were like, well, let's check this place out then. And so there was still this timeline of, okay, let's continue to go. And he was also thinking, I want my kids to be in church. That was another thing that he was really big on. It was just like, I want my kids to be going consistently to church every single Sunday. And so I think that is a really big part of it, is just thinking, is it a preference? Because even if you start a church, you are not going to meet all your preferences. Even if you start and you begin a church and you're like, this is what I want to do, there are going to be certain preferences that people bring up that you're like, okay, well, I really dreamed this up. I really wanted to do this. And then people start poking holes in it. And then you're like, actually, maybe this won't work. And then you have to give up that preference of maybe I want to do this. So there's a certain part where it's just like, okay, I have to give up my preferences. And this is something that God has given. And just kind of leaning into that. And I believe that if you lean into it, God is going to really reward it and really give that, kind of reward that obedience, I guess. So.
And that kind of transitions into the next point. When is it appropriate or should you leave the community that you're involved in? And I think there's kind of like two different aspects of that. There's the theological of like, hey, this church that I thought was doctrinally really sound is turned out to be going off the rails. That is one reason technically that people leave churches, but another is just, well, I'm just not feeling fed here anymore, or it's a person, like you were saying, a personal preference between, well, they do worship this way here, but they do worship that way over there, and I really connect with that one a lot better. I guess there's like a couple of different questions within that, but what would you say good principles for navigating when should you leave a church?
I think good principles for leaving a church would fall under meeting up with the pastor that you've been attending and leading well and saying, hey, and these are hard conversations. They're awkward conversations, extremely awkward conversations, but I think they're good. And leading well, I think, is so important for the Christian body because Jesus even prays that there is unity among the body in John 17. And so making sure that there is no division when you leave, even if you're a single guy and you just leave and there is, you're not taking anybody with you, but making sure that when you leave, there's no division between you and the pastor and doing everything for that. And I think bringing up those things, being like, hey, I don't really like the worship here. This is kind of what I'm looking for. And I think it's fair to ask, do you know any places? Are you connected to any churches in the area that think that you can match this? That's one thing I'm trying to do is just kind of meet up with all the different pastors in Tullahoma and youth pastors in Tullahoma and getting to know them, because I've had, not a ton, but I've had a few of the students say like, hey, like, I'm not really vibing with this. I'm like, okay, well, where are you going to go? I always ask that. Anytime someone says that they want to kind of feel like they're not supposed to be there, they feel called to leave, I'm like, okay, well, where are you going to go? And what are the things that you were looking for? And I want to be able to plug them into that, because ultimately it's up to you. It's really more important that someone is plugged into a good Christian body than really that they attend the Experience Community Church, because it's God's gospel. It's God's ministry. It's not the Experience's gospel. It's the Lord's. It's Jesus. So, yeah, I feel like that. I don't know if I fully answered that question, but
I think you did pretty good.
All right, cool.
We'll call it a pass. And kind of the flip side of that is, okay, I feel like this isn't meeting my personal preference. When would you say is the right time to, for lack of a better term, just kind of get over yourself and say, okay, maybe this isn't how I'd like it. Maybe I could find something that I would like better elsewhere, but this is where I'm at, and I need to learn to be happy with it. When, I guess, would you say is that, or maybe some good indicators that that's the case where, yeah, maybe the grass is greener on the other side, but it would really just be better to stick it out where you're at.
I also think that, kind of going with the analogy, sometimes the grass is greener where you water it, you know? So sometimes there is a part of like, yeah, the grass may be greener, or it may just be, I'm just not watering into it. I'm not pouring into it. I'm not serving anywhere. I'm not in a life group. I'm not connected. So I would say if you are kind of getting plugged in and trying to explore it and giving it an honest try of trying to meet up with people, getting to know people in the area, then, and you still don't feel connected, maybe try something else out. Maybe not. That's kind of really up to you and the Spirit, and you praying about it. Really, and hopefully you have people that you can talk to about that, even if they're not in your area. So say you were from Moscow, Idaho, and you moved to Tampa, Florida. Hopefully you have people in Moscow, Idaho that you can still call up and say like, man, this is what I'm going through. This is what's happening. These are my preferences. I wish this church had that. I wish this church had that. Or they do this and I don't like that. Maybe, hopefully you have some people that you can kind of bounce those ideas off of and you can just talk about it with. And hopefully they can be like, okay, yeah, that sounds like something the Lord's calling you to leave. Or maybe it's like, dude, that's just a preference. We're called to die to ourselves daily. And so there are certain parts of it that was just like, that's a preference. I gotta get rid of that. So.
Awesome. Oh, this is a fun one. Okay. So two single people meet each other, get married,
Yes.
and they both grew up in different church traditions. That's a fun premarital situation
Oh, yeah.
of where are we going to go to church? What do you think about that, and what kind of experiences do you have with it?
Yeah, I remember kind of when we first met up to when you asked me to do this of like, what are some things? I'm like, I thought this would be really cool because I recently had a conversation with my brother about this. To the people watching, it was at his wedding, so don't do that. I tried to do it before premarital. Tried to talk about it before, because he was very much like, I wanted to go somewhere really liturgical. My uncle is Eastern Orthodox. He's been that for 30 years, and so, but his wife grew up Protestant, loved it, loved going to it, loved the worship, loved the teaching. And so he was very much torn, and he's just like, dude, what do I do? So I think it's a great premarital conversation. It's a great discussion to do that. I think it's great for you to, both spouses, to check out both churches at least once. At least pop by. If you're the man, check out the woman's. If you're the woman, check out the man's. So trying to get more check it out, not being like, oh no, we're going here and that's it. Because something I told my brother was that I think that Jesus is in both the church, the Protestant church that they wanted to go to, and then the Eastern Orthodox church that they wanted to go to. I was like, Jesus is both there. And so I'm not saying like you can't go to both, but what I was saying is that as the husband of the house, sometimes you need to lead. And then as the husband of the house, sometimes you need to kind of let yourself die, just as Jesus died for the church. And so I can't determine that for you on whether this is a moment where you lead and say, hey, we're going to go to this church, or if it's a moment where you're just like, okay, this is something that is good for my family. And this is something that we can all get plugged in. And something that I know that we're going to be completely into and step into and not have much resistance. So that's a really, really hard conversation, especially if you're high level volunteer, you're really plugged into the church and you feel God calling you to step away. But I think it kind of goes back to as well, what we were talking about, just leaving well and making sure that you discuss that with the people that are pouring into you, that your community is. And I think the beauty of that also is that just because you kind of leave the church on Sundays doesn't mean you can't stop talking to people that are there. I still talk to friends that don't go to the Experience anymore, right? Just because they stop going here on Sundays and Saturdays doesn't mean I'm like, okay, well, I'm done with you. Deuces. That's not the case. That's not how Jesus works. That's not how I'm going to work either. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, this is another fun one that I wanted to get around to. People talk about, well, I was just really hurt by church when I was growing up, and that's why I don't go anywhere. It's the old, like, I love Jesus, I don't like the church type thing. And on some level, like, you can kind of sympathize depending on what people's experiences were of like, yeah, if that was my experience, I wouldn't be the most eager to jump into another community very similar to the one that I got hurt in. But what would you say to those people who would say that, well, the reason I don't go anywhere or that I've just been really hesitant to try to find anything is previous hurt experiences?
I was actually recently talking to someone about this because they experienced like a lot of church hurt and they're not involved anywhere. They don't go to church anywhere. And they're kind of just going to work and hanging out with friends. But I remember they said that they got hurt real bad. I just told them that church hurt, I think, is a special kind of hurt because it's a spiritual kind of hurt. Church is meant to be the place we're poured into spiritually, where we are fed. We also pour out, but it is a place of pouring in. And so when that hurt happens, that there's a spiritual component to that just is nothing like really anything else. So I very much sympathize with that. And that's so difficult. And I don't wish that on anyone. And a church is filled with people, and people are broken. People have sin. They will sin. And that's really difficult. And sometimes you just, maybe you go to a different church where it's like, okay, they didn't handle that hurt well. They didn't handle the situation well. But also there is a component of it's just me and Jesus. And I'm like, okay, I hear that. It's true. There is a relationship with you and Jesus. And there's also a second part to that commandment of love God and love others. And it's hard to fulfill the greatest commandment when you're not plugged in and you're not around others. You're kind of just doing half the work. And so that I would kind of push back against it. And some people, they need to, when they get hurt by the church, they need to just attend. They just need to get in a group where they can process it. Maybe they don't serve anywhere. And I think that's really important as well. But whether that's continuing at the church that you got hurt at or not, or you just aren't attending at all because you got hurt by a church, I encourage people to kind of just get plugged in, because there's healing that comes from community. There's healing that comes from being in that and being able to process it. And I think once you start sharing how you've been hurt by the church in church, you recognize how common it really is. Mm-hmm. You really recognize, like, okay, I am not the only one that's been hurt by a church. I'm not the only one that's doing that. And you see people that have been hurt by the church, but they continue to stay. And I think that's beautiful, absolutely beautiful. I think it's a testament to their faithfulness, but I think it's also hope for the healing that can happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. In the Following Jesus class, we have a week that we talk specifically about the church, mm-hmm. and a lot of the people, it's kind of hard to keep the discussion away from just talking about how bad people's previous experience at other churches has been, because they want to go to, oh, let me tell you about what these people did. Mm-hmm. In one sense, like, yeah, sure, there's an aspect of sharing your previous experiences, and that's part of your previous experience. But what I usually tell them is you might want to slow down a little bit on how excited you are to be here and not mm-hmm. there, because if you give us long enough, we will find a way to disappoint you.
Absolutely.
We might have to get creative about it, but we will disappoint you at some point, because exactly to what you said, the church is made up of human beings, and human beings are sinful, terrible people that mm-hmm. God has made in his image and has called us to be slightly less terrible together. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that churches also shouldn't be in competition. Some are. Mm-hmm. As Joe says, pretty often he hates, it's like when people say, oh, the Experience is the best church. He's like, no, we are not the best, because the best constitutes and brings up and says, like, oh, that's a competition. Mm-hmm. We want to be a good church. We want to be a really good church that people really enjoy, but we don't want to be the best because we're not in competition with others. And I know that that's sometimes a hard thing to do, because we latch on to good things, and we latch on to things that have really helped us. And so sometimes we say, like, man, the Experience really saved me. And it's like, no, the Experience did not save you. Jesus saved you. The Experience is just lucky enough and fortunate enough that God is gracious enough to be the means by which you are saved. And we are lucky enough to be able to see all these happen, but we're not the means by which it happens. We don't save people. Jesus is the one that saves people. So
I think that's a pretty good high note to wrap it up on. Jord'n, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Ciecka. Appreciate it.